Good morning, everyone. Our next speaker, Dave, is going to be presenting on some of the threats affecting Australia's renewable energy transformation. Please give it up for Dave.
Thank you. I think this is made for taller people. So.
Do you want this one?
Sure. Okay, I'll do the left hand. Yeah, good one. Staying at the camera. Okay. Yeah, look, thanks for coming along. If there's other Melburnians, I know Simon's a Melburnian, so we all came up here to escape the cold weather, and no rain, but we brought it with us. So sorry about that. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you a little bit the obligatory sort of this is where I work and this is what we do sort of slides. Then I'm going to go on to the transformation that's taking place in the Australian energy sector. I'm going to focus on distributed energy resources. It's an area of huge growth, and it's really what's driving Australia's energy system transformation at the moment. I'll give you an idea of how distributed energy resources sort of fit together, like conceptual architecture kind of view, and define some terms and so on. Next, I'm going to have a look at the cybersecurity threats when you're talking about the DER ecosystem and what we need to be aware of. And just I'm going to briefly cover the standards and the security controls that are currently being talked about, like internationally and within Australia. And then hopefully we'll have 5 minutes or so for some questions. So, Energy Australia, we're a retailer and a generator. We've got about 2.5 million customers across the national energy market and the national energy network, which is essentially the east coast of Australia, all the way from Queensland to Tasmania and across to Adelaide. 6.5% of renewable projects in the national energy market are what Energy Australia is responsible for. And I guess one of our lead purposes in being an energy provider in Australia at the moment is to accelerate the transformation to clean energy. So what's going on with the Australian energy sector at the moment? Well, obviously things are changing rapidly. There's less reliance on thermal generators, so the big coal-fired and fossil fuel-fired generators, and there's lots more renewables, and it's happening at speed. I'll get into how fast a little bit later. The energy system is becoming less centralised because households are investing in small-scale generation and storage capabilities, and the energy system itself is starting to need to cater quite drastically to two-way flows. That's energy coming from the generators to the consumers and the other way around. It certainly wasn't built that way, so it's quite an interesting challenge to have to deal with. And lastly, there's significant innovation in energy products, energy bundles, and smart energy things. And all of these attributes are really what's called the smart grid. So at a really high level, the electricity generation in the traditional or sometimes called the bulk energy system predominantly involves these large fossil fuel-fired generators, which are usually close to mines or wells, which is their power source, and they're in reasonably remote areas. Now, high voltage transmission lines then transport the electricity from that generator, those generators, and to substations where it's required. Now, substations have a lot of transformers, that's it, and they transform the high voltage supply to low voltage supply, which is really what is then distributed through the distribution networks to our demand side, which is where we consume the energy. So when we're talking about demand side generation, demand side threats, we're really talking about the significant increase in consumer solar panels, EV storage facilities, and as that increases, we're finding that the need for the large thermal generators is starting to decrease, and it's putting a lot of strain on the existing energy network because it simply wasn't built to cater for large flows in the other direction. I see this as the Kodak moment really for the energy sector globally. It's a decades-old paradigm. It's being superseded by technology advancement at speed. We've got plant assets across Australia. They're becoming financially unviable and it's leading to accelerated mothballing or decommission times. And at the same time, we've also got this dot-com-like explosion of internet-connected smart devices with energy-specific smart appliances, features and functions to provide precise control over the usage and energy consumption. Now, they're helping consumers save money and also generating money. If you've got enough generation and storage on your house, you can sell it back into the market. And it's becoming part of the day-to-day routine. So who's got solar panels? Show of hands. Right, who's got a family member with solar panels? Right, so yeah, it's a pretty good percentage of Australia. It's actually 1 in 4, over 1 in 4 homes in Australia have solar panels or the ability to generate power on their own. That doesn't mean they're necessarily grid connected, but they do have that capability. And that's massive. It's actually the highest residential capability in the world for a generation capability on the roof. Kind of makes sense because we've got a lot of sun. And at the moment, we're in a situation where the energy grid has got so much renewable energy generation capability that we're reaching a threshold of more than 100% of energy generation that's required in the grid is being supplied by renewables. Now, in general, it's only instantaneous, like a couple hours at a time, but South Australia, for example, in both October and December of last year, sort of went over that 100% threshold. So they were essentially generating all of the state's needs with renewable energy, and that's massive. And in fact, last week, the start of last week, California, the whole state of California in the US did the same. So it's the first time ever that they'd actually achieved 100% renewable penetration for instantaneous electricity generation in California. So that's kind of massive. So, distributed energy resources. Time for some definitions, I think. So we're talking about smart devices. You could say it's IoT. Most of them are internet connected. They can generate, consume or store electricity. And they've got the smarts to either actively manage their demand or supply, either through some preset thresholds in the system itself or by instruction over communications networks. There's 3 main types. You've got obviously your generation assets, so your solar panels and inverters, your battery storage systems, and the EVs. EVs are a little bit of a special case because they can be both a load and a generation capability or a supply capability, because with some of the new products and capabilities that we're delivering at speed with our technology, you can actually start to discharge the batteries in your car and monetize that. So if you're not using your car on a Wednesday, you can tell your aggregator that, yeah, you can use my battery on a Wednesday and earn me some money. It's just sitting in the garage. Other types of distributed energy resources are the types of appliances that we have that are smart and have the ability to actively manage their load. So we're talking about sort of machine washers, air conditioners, pool pumps, heating, those sorts of things. It's generally called demand response, which is a slightly different set of standards and terminology, but it basically means by using some of the smarts involved and then potentially hooking in with the spot price of electricity, you can time the usage of those appliances to really manage the costs for running those appliances. Pool pumps is a classic one. Why bother having your pool pumps going when the energy costs the most? Get it done when the spot price is kind of the lowest. The last one really is less about active generation or load. It's more about sort of the smart meters, so everyone would know the advanced metering infrastructure, and I think you've got them in Queensland. We've got them most places these days, certainly in Victoria, and these are really just providing real-time telemetry and usage, and also providing some idea about the reliability and the stability of the network. Back to the distribution network providers and AMO, as it turns out. So while higher penetration of DER is obviously great news from an environmental perspective, there's also issues, and it's important to understand that electricity generation is really only part of the role that these more traditional thermal generators play in the energy market. System security is it's an energy industry term. It basically means reliability and stability. And there's a lot of rules that we have in the national energy market. The WEM, the Western Australian Energy Market, has the same, and that really defines the thresholds that that need to be met to maintain stability and reliability in the electricity network. It's kind of operational requirements. This quote comes from the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO, and they do this, what's called the Integrated System Plan, every couple of years, and they update it. It's kind of a roadmap that sort of dictates, where things are going, what's the sort of things that we need to worry about, and so on. And this is taken from the 2021-22 version of this is out, I think, July. But it's basically saying, because we've got so many renewables and DER devices and that are displacing all the older thermal generators, the system security and reliability services that have been traditionally provided by those thermal generators basically need to be provided by those DERs. So it basically means as we keep increasing DER penetration, DERs are basically going to have to be more flexible, more interoperable, and more reliable to provide more than just generation services. They need these stability services as well. And if we can't provide those system security services, then the quality of supply could be affected. And there's lots of different terms about what that could mean. It could be sort of simply some appliances basically stopping to function properly. It could be localised substation circuit breakers tripping, those sorts of things. So why do we need to secure smart DERs? It almost sort of makes sort of common sense, really. They'll increasingly need to remote operate and accept remote instruction to make sure that the functioning of the grid and the DER is consistent. The bulk energy system has historically operated as a closed environment. We've got sort of mature, technically capable actors with infrastructure behind fences and walls, systems connectivity using proprietary networks and communicating over proprietary protocols. Mostly SCADA and so on. The DERs have almost entirely the opposite characteristics to the bulk energy system. They're purchased or leased by members of the public. They're generally installed in a public or untrusted environment, in your roof or your carport. And they're primarily communicating over the internet, potentially untrusted network, and not necessarily using proprietary protocols either. So a lot of the protocols to control DER are actually using open protocols now, web protocols. So we've got remotely controllable internet-connected devices now powering our grid. What could possibly go wrong? So as a cybersecurity professional, I'm an architect by trade. What we do is we do risk management. So a statement here I sort of put together really is a sort of a motherhood statement. If you could significantly manipulate the way that the DER devices operate en masse, so obviously one or two devices here and there, doesn't matter, but if you actually get a large collection, then you could actually breach the intended thresholds of the energy system and you could impact it, system security and reliability. So that could again mean localised brownouts, appliances, substations tripping, potentially if it was bad enough, you could actually get rolling blackouts, and potentially even islanding of certain states, so where you'd actually have to disconnect states. If a particular state was badly affected, that's kind of what happened in South Australia like a number of years ago. You had an islanding situation, so you're on your own sort of thing. So cybersecurity threats. Being a boxes and lines kind of guy, I'll start off with some boxes and lines. So you've got a conceptual architecture really involves a customer purchasing some kind of DER device or leasing it. A lot of bundles these days coming from different aggregators and retailers allow the customer to lease a device. And then an installer will come along and connect that into the distribution network, and also generally up to the internet or up to at least a network whereby they can get firmware updates and configuration data from the manufacturer. Now, in general, there's a customer wants to monetize the investment that they've made, which is perfectly reasonable. Virtual power plant operator will then be connected into the system as well, and then they can actually dispatch the power that's being stored in, say, the batteries or whatever else the customer has installed in their premises. and that way the customer can earn some money. And additionally, often there's a smart app or something that's provided by the manufacturer or the aggregator to say, well, this is your battery and this is how it's performing, or this is how much energy you're creating off your roof at the moment. So, of those in the room who've got panels, who's got a smart app or something on their device that tells them how they're going? Yeah, exactly. And this is kind of a general example architecture, and there's obviously a lot of different ways things are put together, but this is kind of generally the way it goes. So if we look at all the different actors that we have in this ecosystem, and we're going from the bulk energy system, which is behind closed fences and walls, proprietary protocols, blah, 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 this is where we are at the moment. We have a number of different actors in this system that are potential sources of threats. But compromise is unlikely, right? Yeah, not sure about that. Back to the context of our risk statement, we want to work out a likelihood, and I wanted to sort of cover a couple of mainstream media articles that have kind of been in the news lately, and this is about 6 weeks ago. It was in the ABC. It was a bit of a jawboning article, really. It didn't really have any facts behind it, but this one didn't really get a great deal of coverage, but I think this is particularly relevant to this discussion. The article was, or the issue was covered separately by a different media outlet, and they kind of got straight to the point, really. So you essentially have some devices, UPSs, can be remotely hijacked and destroyed. You can replace the firmware, put a crypto miner in there, whatever you want to do. Now, this is really interesting from my perspective for 3 reasons. Firstly, it's white-labelled device, but it's actually distributed by Schneider Electric. And Schneider is a massive energy industry vendor. Lots of SCADA sites are Schneider sites. They're $30 billion annual revenue company. They're massive. So read into that what you will, but the fact that we've got people that to an extent should know better distributing devices with these vulnerabilities, that's kind of an issue. The second issue here is, the second key point is its supply chain risk. So yes, it was Schneider's names on the tin, but this is a white-labelled device. It was built by a subsidiary. But it sort of shows you that supply chain risk. Like if the manufacturer of the devices are having issues identifying vulnerabilities in devices that their subsidiaries are providing, kind of what chance do consumers have to actually better manage supply chain risk if they're buying a device? And lastly, these devices, a UPS is basically an inverter. So you're actually inverting DC battery storage into AC. And this is exactly what we're talking about in this example conceptual architecture. So if I point out, we've got this vulnerability here in an inverter. It's obviously not this inverter because it's it's not connected up to the grid. But so let's just say we had an ability for that same CVE to be relevant to inverters in this ecosystem. Then essentially any of these actors with direct access to the device on the same network could then do whatever they want. They could create new firmware, push it to the device and have it do whatever they like. No authentication. So, and you've also got a couple of paths here that could also be sources or threat of those threat scenarios. Replacement of firmware on the device. Again, do whatever you want if you get that upload that new firmware. And of course, other threats because you're on you're connected into that sort of ecosystem. And also, I mean, given that we're using, in a lot of cases, we're using the home routers, we've seen doorbells and, smart switches and whatever else. They've got sort of questionable security practices. A lot of people aren't the kinds of people that are in this room that are probably going to try and secure an implementation of IoT devices on their home network. And that's kind of the situation that we're left with, pretty much a vulnerable ecosystem. So we've got a vulnerable device. What sort of controls can we look at? So first and foremost, robust identification, authentication and authorization. I've done identity for a lot of years in banks and so on, and it's a really, really tough nut to crack. It's always changing. It's one of those things that you need people. You need to actually do your use cases, understand what privileges are required, map them appropriately to roles, make sure that people that leave the organisations are deprovisioned or whatever else. So it's definitely a tough area, but obviously, that particular vulnerability with no authentication, you can change the firmware. That'd be one you'd probably want to start to control with some identity and access management capabilities. Secondly, making sure that your firmware that's getting updated is coming from an authentic source and it's maintaining its integrity. Segmentation, making sure that maybe the devices themselves are running on a separate segment, so it's not as easy to just directly access those devices, and obviously hardening any systems that are implementing the security controls to stop that. And lastly, security monitoring. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but security monitoring is obviously really important in this ecosystem. So on to some words about standards and security controls now. So globally, when we talk about standards in the DER space, they really focus on two areas. Now, first of all, is those rules and regulations for actually interacting into certain regional markets, operational requirements, you could say. So the standards for, say, the US and Australia are different in that respect because, we have different voltage, for example. And secondly, there's also a concentration of standards defining the functional capabilities of the DER devices. They're changing quite rapidly as we sort of work out we need more and more capabilities for those devices. It also includes, in a lot of cases, security controls. The kinds of functional capabilities are basically the ability to withstand an adverse or withstand or recover quickly from an adverse condition on the grid. Now, interoperability is a key goal, and from an IT architecture perspective, that really means integration, ease of integration. So we're talking about standardised messaging, standardised information models and APIs that elicit the consistent behaviour between devices in general and between particular devices of the same family. So that means if I make an API call to this DER device and it's a battery, I expect that device to do this thing. And that needs to be consistent across all the batteries that are built and then sent into the grid, because otherwise you're just going to end up with a mess. It needs to be reliable. It means the manufacturers, if you've got standards that dictate all of this stuff, that manufacturers can build and certify compliance to a single standard, and then they can sell those devices into multiple different markets. Makes it cheaper for them, cheaper for the end consumer. Oops. I don't know how to do that. It also makes the products easy for a customer to move around. So you can basically potentially pick a different battery. You could have a solar inverter and a solar panel set up that's got a different type of battery, and maybe the battery, you maybe want to get a Tesla Powerwall battery, for example, because you like the look of it, or it fits in the cupboard nicely, or whatever it might be. Or maybe they've got better service and warranty for a particular type of battery. So from an international perspective, and if we're talking specifically about security, there's lots of different regional standards. The British Standards Institute and the European standards have different overall standards talking about DER functionality and capability, but the US is sort of, I think, really charged ahead in a lot of these areas because they've kind of had to. California and Hawaii, two particular geographies that have really sort of, really taken off when it comes to renewable energy. So back in 2003, IEEE 1547 it's called the Standard for Interconnecting Distributed Resources with Electric Power Systems. So, that's pretty much it. It sort of describes those functional and sort of grid requirements. In 2005, the federal government in the US basically said that this is our standard. So if you look at that from 2005, now that's almost 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the US was thinking about how they're going to deal with distributed energy resources. We're a long way behind. We don't have any of that. So So this standard also keeps getting updated, and one of the particular member-led organisations that's actually progressed a lot of this work is Sunspec. You might know Sunspec from Sunspec Modbus, obviously a protocol in the more SCADA, OCS, OT space. They've got a protocol, it's basically I call it a profile, like it's a subset of capability, subset of functions that's been taken from IEEE 2030.5. 2030.5 is a smart grid communications protocol. The CSIP is basically a subset of those functions, and that's really just targeted to the US grid, particularly California, to meet what's called CA Rule 21, which is the mandated requirement. So if you're going to try and connect up a DER device in California, you have to certify the device, and if you certify to CSIP, then you meet those California Rule 21 requirements. The other services that Sunspec offers is the ability to certify a device, and they also offer a PKI for those certified devices. So they run the standard, they make sure that your devices can meet that standard, and then if you sort of get those ticks in the box, then you can actually get a certificate then you can then use to bake into your devices to provide identity and secure comms with anybody talking CSIP. In Australia, there is some work. It's kind of happened very speedily, given that there's a lot of focus on this at the moment. So ARENA has a think tank. There's lots of acronyms here. Sorry about that. I get mixed up myself. CSIP Oz has basically been a working group to take CSIP, which is again the subset of 2030.5, from the US and modify it for Australia's system. Again, we have slightly different operating kind of requirements in Australia, so it does need a few tweaks and so on. There is some security capabilities in CSIP, and there's a DER working group around cybersecurity that's looking for just validating the controls in CSIP to make sure that they're the right things for Australia. By all means, go and have a look. It's not that complicated, but from a security perspective, but there's definitely some questions that need to be asked. So the kinds of questions that need to be asked, these are my thoughts only and observations. They're not they're not Energy Australia's by any stretch of the imagination. Again, that identity and access management question, access control. There's nothing in the standards that currently dictate how you should do that. There's suggestions about how you could do that, but because it's not standardised, there's no way to sort of implement it in a standardised fashion. I think that's something that's absolutely super important. It's something, identity and access management is something that, it's tough, but we understand it really well, so we should be applying those types of controls in our standards environment. Secondly, the legacy environment, so there's lots of inverters, batteries, solar panels, cars, etc. out there that won't be compliant to any of these standards because they were bought 5 years ago or however many years ago. So whatever security standards and controls we put in now, we know that there's a whole body of the 10 or 15 year lifetime devices out there that won't be able to be compliant. And that could be for a number of reasons, but even some of them just won't have the compute power to deal with certificates and validating a cert, or creating a set of private public keys because they just don't have the grunt. The other thing I've found in general with all the standards, maybe except one, there's one in the EV space which seems to be, they've looked really well in this area, that's called OCPP, is that they're not really using assume breach as a principle when they're looking at the standards. Very heavy focus on preventative controls. But then the question is, what do you do if you are breached? How do you knock a particular manufacturer's device or devices off the network if you want to, if they've been compromised? Let's say someone sent some malware or ransomware infected firmware down to every air conditioner. For it's possible. But so how do you stop that from spreading? Not been a great deal of thought in that at the moment because it's hard. From non-technical reasons, this is a bit of a whinge really, but I just think that in any cybersecurity engagement, if you're in an organisation, you generally need to understand your risk appetite because that really dictates how much time, money you spend on implementing security controls. And I don't think there's been much understanding of what our risk appetite is for grid systems. And we can say, oh, it's rock solid, and but it's not. At the end of the day, consumers are going to have to pay for it. It's not, the government's not going to turn up with $60 billion and say, hey, this is how we secure our DER environment. So it's going to flow down the line through retailers, through manufacturers of devices to secure. So, and even the question of who makes that call? Who makes the call about what amount of risk is acceptable for the energy grid? Mandatory compliance, obviously CI-SONS is lots of fun. It doesn't cater for DER at the moment specifically, unless you're actually aggregating 30 megawatts or above. I can see why they did that, so they don't want to squash competition for the small players that are trying to, encourage renewable energy. But by the same token, there are a number of different aggregators that'll hit that threshold and exceed it at some point. And I doubt that you'll be able to continue this this trajectory that we currently have without some kind of regulation, essentially. So that 30 megawatts, which is about 6,000 5-kilowatt exporting devices, will probably go down at some stage, possibly. Standards hell. So, it's kind of ubiquitous in our industry and in IT in general. You obviously got the geographic bodies that like to sort of take ownership and build their own standards because that's their business model. You've got the professional organisations that are also producing their standards, which may or may not align with what's coming out from a geography perspective. And then you've got, I guess, more the specific families and energy industry groups and not-for-profit groups that are creating their own standards. And I can see that already that we're going to have an interesting time sort of mapping security controls between different standards to work out. So you might end up having to have multiple different sets of security controls just to meet the standards that are applicable in this area. I think I'm getting close to time now. So, a couple other questions, and really just getting back again to those standards. Really, the Energy Security Board that sets policy for Australia's energy grid system, particularly the NEM, have sort of asked specifically some of the questions with the PKI. The PKI is sort of a 2030.5 construct. It's not mandated, but it's how you would actually try to establish trust in this ecosystem. Do we need one? Do we need more than one? How might that work? Is it okay if it's not an Australian entity that is the CA for our grid? It's a really quite fundamental question. And there's lots of different answers, lots of pros and cons that need to be worked through. And particularly in this area, 2030.5 and CSIP, you are not able to revoke certificates. So you can't actually revoke certificates. You could probably do some smarts to sort of block certain certificates. So like in that scenario where a manufacturer did get popped and did start to push malicious firmware down the line, what would you do, and how would you do it quickly? At the moment, we can't revoke, which I think, if you've got a PKI, it's all about trust. So, it sort of seems a little bit strange. Compliance and governance, again, if there are standards, and these are going to come up the wrong way around, fantastic. If there's standards, how often do we test the standards? What's the impact of the standards from a cost and an implementation perspective with what happens to the legacy environment? And ongoing assurance, like if there is a standard that you need to check for. Personally, from my perspective, if we've got a really high risk, our risk appetite is low for this area, I would think that every time you create a new set of firmware, you should test it against a standard. So you get a bit of an idea that from an assurance perspective, maybe you can even review the code to see that there's nothing malicious in there and make sure you've got proper functionality and proper ability to apply the security controls. But there's a cost associated with that. So look, just winding up now. Essentially, energy system is increasingly leveraging potentially vulnerable smart devices and IoT systems. The interconnected system, that ecosystem, is really only strong as its weakest link, and supply chains of particular interest, and is very tough to deal with and to secure. And the standards, I think, are heading in the right direction, but the implementation is going to be interesting. Right, that's all I had for today. Any questions?
First, can we get a round of applause for Dave? So we do have a few minutes for questions. This one's just a quick one from me. So as an attacker, these are obviously something that I want to pop and do some fun stuff with. Mm-hmm. Say I pop an inverter,
yep.
What sort of damage can I do? Or is it only in numbers where I can sort of have an impact?
I think realistically it's numbers. You could, I mean, locally you could, if it was a local area of the grid, you could force, you could force a brownout, force some substations to trip, which would sort of affect the localised supply in that area, and particular inverters, of a particular, manufacturer or whatever. You might end up being able to blow up a few appliances here and there in the house. So, yeah.
Fair enough. So you're saying the best way to impact the grid is still the old explosives at the substation?
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, cool. So we have got a couple of questions that have come through the app, so we'll go through those first. Simon, you had a couple of questions?
Yeah, I believe one of them is you answered the standards.
Yep.
The other one's basically we've got like a MSP situation. Oh, sorry. Yep. Basically, we have an MSP situation where you've got the installers, the VPPs, all of them have back-end access, and I have 2 different systems and 4 inverters that currently have this. And I note that people get in there and they update the firmware, and I go, no, oh, you've updated the firmware. Oh, we've changed how the battery is operating. Suddenly we're not using it, the VPP's using it. Now, that's fine, in inverted commas, within the contracts, but how are you going to secure those MSPs? Because I know some of those don't even understand why you wouldn't use Wi-Fi and why you'd want to plug via Cat5 cable. It took me an hour's argument. It's like, no, you're running cable and plugging it in. How are we going to secure that environment? Because that's where your main attack's going to come to get the numbers.
Yep. Yeah, look, great question. That's why the title is only talks about threats, not securing it. but yeah, so it's I suspect that players, if you're going to aggregate and over time, that there will be some standards to maintain a minimum baseline. And those, if you've got multiple users of the battery, and it's going to be even more important as we start to get more and more EVs around, because EV is not something that's just connected to your house. So there's some mobility stuff that needs to happen there as well. But yeah, look, it's I think there will be a need to mandate some baselines. I think that ESB is aware that something needs to be done in that area. And I think, really, it's not, the security controls piece of it isn't rocket science. We've been doing some of this stuff for a long time, so they just have to do it. Yeah, yeah. And the only other thing is, I would hope that that the market might actually start to differentiate itself. So if you've got some providers out there that are taking security seriously and have got a really good digital interface and good support and whatever else like that, maybe there's...
They're currently getting penalised. Sorry, I'll start again. They're currently getting penalised because to do that, it's costing them more. So they're coming in at slightly higher price. Now, I paid 10-12% more than I could have to get exactly the same gear, because I went with a supplier where I actually had good conversations around the architecture and I knew they kind of got it, versus the, hey, can we sell you a solar system?
Yeah.
Right? But that's actually going to hurt them unless we put in something like, 27001 for installers, where you go, you must do all of this to get your CEC license or something like that.
Yep.
So.
Yep. No, I completely agree. There has to be a mandate of a baseline of capability to raise the bar to start with, and then we can, once we have a bar, we don't have a bar. So once we've got a bar, we can aim higher than the bar.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we're out of time for questions. I know there were a few people in the audience who had some more, so you able to take questions after you talk?
Sure.
Yeah.
Or send me an email or whatever. It's in the app. So.
All right, fantastic. So ask those questions through the app. I believe you can answer the questions directly through the app as well.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah. So please give it up for Dave.
Thanks.
We'll be starting off the next talk in a couple of minutes.